Hello, my name is John Riutta, and I am the Product Development Manager for Binoculars, Spotting Scopes, Microscopes, and Elements Outdoor Electronics at Celestron. Many of you have written to Dear Celestron recently, stating that you have recently taken up birdwatching. Good for you. It's an excellent hobby, one that I've practiced myself for decades. But in taking up birdwatching, your question has been, what binocular should I choose? There are a wide range of binoculars. Celestron makes dozens. And they're all a bit different, and they all have their best uses. Now, when choosing a binocular, it's always important to know what you're going to be doing with it and where you're going to be doing that with it. In the case of bird watching, you've already checked the first question. But where are you going to be bird watching? I'd like to start with explaining a good general binocular selection for birdwatching, and then follow up with a little bit about some specialty binoculars that might be useful for birdwatching. First of all, a few terms to get out of the way. Field of view. Field of view is the image of the world you see while looking through the binocular. A wide field of view indicates that you're going to be able to see a fairly wide span of the world in front of you, whereas a narrow field of view tends to close in the image of the world that you see. Generally speaking, higher magnification, which is the magnifying power of the binocular, you can think of it in terms of either making the things that you see that many times larger or bringing them that many times closer to you, is directly related to field of view. The next thing that you should know is that the objective diameter, which is, I'll use a visual aid here, the objective end is measured in millimeters, and that is its objective diameter. Objective diameter doesn't have much to do with field of view. I know, someone's told you that it did. Trust me, it doesn't. It's more a factor of the optical design itself and the magnification. Higher magnifications generally constrict the field of view. And that's all right, because there are times when you want a very high magnification and you're not particularly concerned with how wide the field of view is in front of you. For bird watching, however, it's a good idea to have as wide a field of view as possible. The reason for this, birds, as you might have noticed, are generally rather small. They're covered with feathers, they have wings, and consequently, most of them, of course, we're excluding ostriches, kiwis, penguins, but you generally don't run into those unless you really go out of your way, are capable of instantaneous three-dimensional movement. So the bird that you might be watching sitting in a tree, peacefully minding its own business, suddenly takes flight, and it can go in any number of directions at a rapid rate of speed. Therefore, you need to be able to see that bird as it takes off and be able to follow it. Also, when watching birds, a wide field of view is particularly valuable if they're in flight. If you see a bird that's flying in from one side of the sky, and you want to get that bird in field of view, having a wide field of view is going to enable you to see it more quickly, more easily, and follow it as it moves. So let's see. We've talked about field of view. We've talked about objective diameter. We've mentioned a little bit about magnification. So now let's put a couple of things together. All binoculars will be identified with magnification and objective. So if you go to your local binocular retailer and your binocular retailer tells you that the binocular they recommend is an 8 by 42, you can instantly know two things about that binocular. One, that it's an 8 magnification binocular. That's the 8 in 8 by 42, and that means it brings things either 8 times closer to you or makes them appear 8 times larger. And the second thing you know is that it has a 42 millimeter objective lens. That's the 42 at the end. So 8 by 42. You could have perhaps an 8 by 32, which would be, of course, an 8 power binocular with a 32 millimeter objective lens. Some of the larger binoculars that are used for astronomy, of course, are, for instance, 15 by 70, which would be a 15 magnification by 70 millimeter objective, or even larger. For bird watching, I like to recommend something in the neighborhood of between 6 and 8 magnification. 6 to 8 magnifications generally have field of view that is above 7 degrees. Now, 7 degrees. Think back to your trigonometry, or if you never took trigonometry, it's really not that hard. Binocular field of view is often measured in triangulated measurement, so degrees. If you think of a clock, 360 degrees in a circle, each degree is one portion of that. So 7 degrees would be a triangle going out. The reason it's measured in that is because field of view is a circular cone. Imagine, if you will, you're looking at something, and something that was brought up directly in front of your eye would, of course, seem very narrow in the grand scheme of things. But as you go away from you, your field of view enlarges. It's a natural perspective issue. So 7 degrees or 8 degrees, we can take it to make it a more even number, at 1,000 yards would be a straight line measurement of 400 feet. So 7 degrees as opposed to 8 would be about 300 feet. Generally, as a matter of course, you can say that 1 degree of field of view is about 50 feet when seen at a distance of 1,000 yards. It's not exact, but that's a good way to think about it. So then, back to 6 to 8 magnification generally yields a nice wide field of view to keep everything in view. But, I hear you say, don't I want a higher magnification to bring a very small object closer in vision? Sometimes, but generally, no. Higher magnification, as we've said, generally constricts your field of view. So, that means that if you're watching a very small bird and it suddenly takes flight, it will go out of your field of view more rapidly than if you have a lower magnification with a wider field of view. Also, something else to consider. As we age, and this should attest to the fact that I've got a few years on me, our hands start to shake a little bit. It's a natural progression of life. Higher magnification binoculars, when held in the hand for large periods of time, are more prone to showing a shaking motion when you look through them. So, as you age, you should always bring down the magnification when possible. Perhaps if you're 18 or 20 years old at the prime of your physical condition and you don't have a particular fondness for coffee or tea, you don't shake at all, and so you could hold a higher magnification with greater steadiness than someone like me with a horrible tea addiction and quite a few decades under my belt could. So, lower magnification for wider field of view. But what about objective? Well, I generally don't like to be toting around a large, heavy binocular for long periods of time. As you reduce the objective diameter, the weight of the binocular overall tends to decrease. And as it decreases, it becomes a little bit more comfortable to carry. Therefore, I like 32 millimeter objectives. So for instance, this would be an 8 by 32 millimeter objective binocular. This actually happens to be one of the ones that I carry in the field. It's our new Celestron Ultima Poro. As long as the objective is at least 4 times the magnification. You'll have a nice bright image if you're using a quality binocular like a Celestron, of course. Anything smaller than that becomes a compact, which has their use, but for all day in the field, it's good to have what's considered to be a full-size binocular. And generally speaking, a full-size binocular has an objective diameter that's at least 4 times the magnification. So this could be an 8 by 42, which would be roughly 5 times, a little bit more than 5 times, the ratio. Or it could be a 10 by 42 perhaps, and that would still be 4 times. And so that's always something to think about. You want a full-size binocular. But as you've now seen me pull out a couple of binoculars, what's the difference between this one and this one? This, as I've mentioned before, the Celestron Ultima Poro binocular, is a Poro prism binocular. You'll know a Poro prism because it is the traditional binocular shape. It has the wide shoulders. And as you'll notice, the eyepieces are a little bit closer together than the objective. That's because there are 2 prisms in here that actually shift the light into a path that gives you a wider spaced objective. Now, there are some advantages to this. One of the biggest ones is that, as you'll notice, this lines up with my eyes. The objectives are wider. Therefore, when I'm looking out into the world, I have the advantage of a more 3-dimensional image because of those wider spaced objectives. This is what's called a roof prism binocular. The roof prism binocular was a design that was created later than the Poro prism binocular in order to make a more sleek binocular for easier carrying in the field. This is a relatively small Poro, but there are much larger ones. And once upon a time, a rather crafty optical engineer said, we can make this a little bit sleeker, and so we came up with the roof prism binocular. The roof prism binoculars are what tends to be the most popular right now. They're sleek, they're straightforward and easy to hold, but you'll also notice that the eyepieces are roughly the same distance as the objectives are from each other. Now that simulates the image that you naturally see. It does not give you an enhanced 3-dimensional image of the object, but it does provide for very easy, rapid use, and it gives you roughly the same image that you would see naturally with your own eyes. That is a matter of personal preference. As I said, I tend to prefer the Poros. I tend to be a little old-fashioned. The highest performing models that have all of the latest coatings, for instance, this is our Nature DX ED binocular, they tend to have all of the so-called bells and whistles, and those bells and whistles are important. So most of the cutting edge level technology is going to be found in a roof prism. However, for classicists like me, we still cling to some of the old Poros, but in fact, either of these is an excellent choice for a bird watching binocular. So that's basically the overview of selecting a binocular for bird watching. I hope I haven't gotten too deep into the weeds, but sometimes when you're watching the really interesting birds, they tend to hide in the deep weeds. So you'd probably better get used to it if you're going to be afield in search of your feathered quarry. Of course, the where of bird watching is also something that needs to be considered in terms of perhaps a specialty choice of binocular. For most people, everything that I've said will stand for a general use birdwatching binocular. However, for my friends in the United Kingdom, where birdwatching is often done from a viewing hide rather than by walking around in the field, the birds are all going to be viewed coming into an area that is predefined directly in front of the viewing hide. Consequently, being able to see them and watch them for longer periods of time, as they are often feeding, as viewing hides are set up in terms of wetland areas quite often, or fields, A stronger magnification binocular is acceptable and can be quite desirable. For example, my own little 8x32 Celestron Ultima Poro is great for use in the field and could also be a great binocular for use in a viewing hide. But its larger family member, the 10 magnification 10x50 Celestron Ultima Poro, could be an excellent choice because as one will be seated for prolonged periods in a viewing hide watching a defined area out in front, the higher magnification would allow a more detailed view of a bird that's more likely to be staying in one place for a longer period of time. Now you'll notice that the objectives on this are quite a bit larger than the objectives on the Ultima 8x32. And that's because as the magnification gets higher, you'll want that larger objective diameter to give it the nice 5-to-1 ratio. We talked about a 4-to-1 ratio, but when you go up in magnification, you always want to make sure that you have sufficient objective diameter so that the image that you're seeing is nice and bright. As magnification goes up, the aperture would stop down if the objective diameter didn't get larger as well. This is also a very good choice if you are in any coastal area where you are watching birds that are at a great distance. Perhaps you're standing on a beach or you're standing on a promontory looking out at a sea rock with birds nesting on it. This binocular at a higher magnification, 10x50, will get you a much better view of a very distant bird. And say that your Uncle Rupert gave you a little extra cash for the holidays. If you're going to be in a very stable area where you're going to be watching perhaps nesting birds at a great distance, again, we get to sea watch where you're watching perhaps birds offshore, or you're going to be studying a particular wetland or a lake where the birds are very inactive and staying in the same place, you could even bring in one of our astronomical binoculars. This, for example, is a 15 by 70 millimeter. Now, this is of course not suitable for general walking around field bird watching as the field of view is extremely narrow. But if the birds are going to be in one place and expected to stay there for some time, this will give you a binocular view at a magnification that is normally only found in a spotting scope. Not a full-time bird watching binocular by any means, but if you're going to take it seriously and you're going to be in an area that allows you such opportunities, not a bad choice for perhaps an additional piece of equipment to add to your field kit box. Well, that's it for Celestron. I'm John Ryuta. If you have other questions, make sure to post them to Dear Celestron and tag them with the hashtag Dear Celestron, and we'll answer them. Thank you very much.